Hey guys, Sasta here with another episode of the King of the Hill Challenge in Highgrounds, where I compete in the daily event and try to progress my standings on the leaderboard. The first deck I have chosen today is Skeleton Reanimator. This is not the same Reanimator combo deck that currently plagues the ladder, the one that tries to end the game as soon as possible, but is rather a slower and more inconsistent version that has more potential reanimation targets than just the two Jimmians. Do not get me wrong, however, I will still be doing very unfair things with Ezek, but I hope that this will be a slightly more interactive game for my opponents. Looking at the game, you can see that my opponent has been successfully slowing down my deck with aggressive flares. Unfortunately for my opponents, however, that kind of interaction is exactly what Reanimator decks thrive on. I sell my unharmed economy units to Ford and Ezek, and throw him right in front of where my opponent last positioned his Wounder. That is a small mind trick you can do to win mind games against your opponents. Players are accustomed to shuffling around their Wounders to try to outguess your positions, as they should, because it just feels inherently wrong to keep a Wounder in the same place. Therefore, by throwing your most valuable unit right where their Wounder was last positioned, you can have a cheeky way to keep your necessary unit alive. The number 9 in the bottom left-hand corner means that my next turn is going to be a bit dicey, so I'd have to keep Ezek as low as possible on the field. If he gets hit, I will not see him for a minimum of 3 turns due to my deck just getting reshuffled. The number 9 means that there were 9 cards in my deck, and I draw 4 new cards every turn due to my city, Twyla, having 4 recruits. Ezek has the frail ability, meaning that if he gets wounded, he is placed into my discard pile where he waits with sold units or units who I opted not to purchase until I have less cards in my deck than my current recruits, in which event my deck would get reshuffled. If Ezek had gotten hit this last turn, then my opponent's flares would have locked me out of the game. Thankfully, however, Ezek narrowly avoided the hits, and I am free to abuse his Reanimator ability for another turn. Or, at least I would, but my opponent understandably conceded. As we jump into the second game, you can see that my opponent is the same one from the last game. I generally play at odd hours, and I will sometimes face the same opponent over and over again if the queue is otherwise empty. Because I am a jerk, I counter-queued my opponent with my favorite control deck, Albatross, which aims to shut down my opponent in a single turn. I start off with the beautifully awful start of a single Ob, which is only barely better than my opponent's Kiln. And, because I know what deck my opponent is on, I play around the turn 2 flare, which to nobody's surprise, my opponent has. Since my opponent didn't play around it in the last game, I do the same trick as before where I run the unit I need to stay alive, in this case Doug, in the same position as the last place my opponent's Wounder was on. It works like a charm. The reason I want to keep Doug alive instead of Mag is because if Doug gets hit, his fragile ability will take him off the field. If Mag gets hit, however, I can either heal him to harass my opponent with a fireball, or sell him for a small amount of money. I spend a bit of time in the tank, but eventually I set up my units in a Mander that can best play around Flare while still allowing for Roko's heal to be effective. Nothing really interesting happens during combat, but I try to set up a near guaranteed draw on my commander during the next turn to shut down my opponents. I swing and I miss, however, as the only unit I didn't draw in my entire deck is of course my commander. So instead, I simply strengthen my economy a bit more and pray that I don't get wiped out by double Kemp on my Rokos. Good news, both my Rokos survived my opponent's wound attempts. Bad news, however, surprised Linnea. Out of nowhere, my opponent reveals why he had been breaking during the last game by throwing out a Matriarch package. Thankfully, my opponent misses on the first attempts. So, on this next turn, I sell a few units to afford Guild and Albatross, then I set up my commander, being Albatross, with Guild and Mag to wound every conceivable spot on my opponent's board except for one spot. I assume that my opponent would shuffle Linnea around since he knows what deck I am playing. I have literally played Maple hundreds of times. Maple, reading the situation, gets a good read and keeps Linnea alive, at the cost of most of the rest of his team. Marsh is an excellent stall unit due to his Guardian ability wounding himself in exchange for saving a few points of life. So, even though it would appear that Ma could threaten a clock, his incoming damage is negligible, equaling to about 1 point of city damage. We get to look at a fun little graphical bug courtesy of how Highground handles multiple frail units being knocked out. I shuffle around my units a bit more, and during the combat phase, I knock out every last unit on my opponent's army, Linnea included. The rest of the game is just a formality. Maple will never set up a meaningful economy for the rest of the game, and Marsh's siege ability, essentially adding 8 attack if I win the combat phase with my commander on the field, will allow me to close out the game in 2 turns. As a precaution, I keep the lock online. Likewise, I choose to keep double Roko instead of 1 Roko, 1 Slog, since, even though Slog would deal 1 extra city damage when in tandem with Onzo's Dogpack ability, my incoming clock would still remain at 2 turns. With the second game out of the way, I move on to the third and final game. I know that at this point my opponent will once again be Maple. I decide to not be a jerk this time, and I don't counter-cue him. Instead, I play a fun little deck that I just threw together based around Spirit aggro. I choose the greedy play of turn 1 Gasper, which is rarely the correct play, especially if I had the option of a turn 1 Roarth, but I am just having fun at this point. Sadly, for my opponent, he begins the game without an economy unit turn 1, which is an aggro deck stream. You can see me look at my commander I added. I made a mistake, and instead of adding my crystal commander, I accidentally added my gold knight commander. I debated a bit with myself to see which unit I should buy, and ultimately chose Sar to go for a windfall economy play on the next turn, and to deal 2 damage to my opponent when in tandem with Rowan. My opponent on this upcoming turn fails to find any economy units once again, and I decide to sell my Sar to afford my 2 Nevils, the Spirit Lords, and the cornerstone behind this deck. Neville has the ability of adding 2 attack for every spirit on my front row. My opponent is grateful to be able to find a few decent economy units, but at this point it is too late for him as I am already far ahead on both tempo and I have an established clock. On this upcoming turn, I decide to keep my Nevils in the back row, but in retrospect, it may have been a mistake, since I could have threatened lethal next turn. The extra economy does help a bit, however, as on this upcoming turn I am able to purchase every unit that I have drawn in this phase. After going over the math while editing this video, I realized that I could have ended the game right here on this very next turn. My misplay bought my opponent 1 extra turn, which in this deck could have locked me out of the game. Misplace aside, I am still able to output a large amount of damage, enough to set my opponent down to 1 health in this instance, which this deck is more than capable of dishing out. My opponent has bought a small army of flare units in an attempt to shut me down, but especially since he missed both Nevils, it is way too little, way too late. To save on time, I will cut out the fact that it took me over 20 seconds to decide on my in-game position, and instead just show me closing out this game. Spirits is a very fun deck to play, and relatively cheap to pick up. Of course, it isn't the monster that is the Reanimator combo deck, but it is still capable of putting up results, especially if your opponent skips a turn. Also, unlike the Reanimator combo deck, I don't see this deck getting nerfed in the future. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this gameplay and would like to try out this game for yourself, feel free to do so by following the link in the description down below. Highgrounds is one of my favorite games, and I only wish I could see more people playing this free and unique game. Especially now that I have a new computer, I am planning on doing many more deck techs, King of the Hill challenges, strategy guides, or really anything else that people want to see. If you have a suggestion for something you'd like to see, leave a comment down below and I'll be happy to oblige.